You are standing in the middle of a lake, not beside it, in it. The water stretches flat and silver in every direction, ringed by volcanoes, sitting more than 2,000 meters up inside a bowl of mountains, with no river leading out. There is no city here. There is barely any dry land. And yet, in about 700 years, more than 20 million people will live on this exact spot. A World Cup final will be won on top of this water twice. And the whole enormous city will be slowly, quietly, sinking back down into the lake you are standing in right now. So why here? Of all the places on Earth to build one of the largest cities humanity has ever made, why in the middle of a salty lake, on top of a mountain, with nowhere for the water to drain? Let the land explain it. Look down at where you stand. You are in the Valley of Mexico, a high basin almost 2.5 kilometers above the sea. Around you rise volcanoes, 2 of them snow-capped. And here is the first strange thing about this place. It is what geographers call endorhe. That just means closed. The rivers that run down off the mountains flow into this basin and then stop. There is no exit. The water has nowhere to go, so it pools across the valley floor into a chain of 5 shallow lakes. The biggest one in the center is Lake Texcoco, and it is salty because in a basin with no outlet the minerals wash in and never leave. Picture it. A ring of mountains, a flat sheet of brackish water in the middle. Reeds, marsh, mud, and clouds of water birds. To most people, this would look like the worst possible place to start a civilization. But geography is never only about the obstacle, it is about who arrives and what they need. Around the year 1325, a wandering people called the Mexica came into this valley. They were latecomers. Every patch of good farmland on the shore was already claimed by older, stronger groups who looked down on these newcomers and pushed them away. The Mexica were left with the one thing nobody else wanted, the swampy, snake-infested islands out in the middle of the salt lake. And according to their own story, that was exactly the point. Their god Huitzilopochtli had told them to settle where they saw an eagle perched on a cactus, eating a snake. On a small rocky island in Lake Texcoco, they say, they saw it. That eagle and cactus and snake sit at the center of the Mexican flag to this day. So they stayed, and here the land's hidden gift finally shows itself. That useless lake was actually a fortress. An island in the middle of water is almost impossible to attack. Enemies could not simply march an army across. The lake also teemed with food, fish, frogs, insects, and migrating birds. And the shallow water itself could be turned into farmland, if you were clever enough. The Mexica were. They built chinampas. Picture long, narrow rectangles staked out in the shallows, then filled with mud and rotting plants dredged from the lakebed until they rose just above the surface. Floating gardens, people later called them, though they did not really float, they were anchored to the bottom. The lake mud was endlessly fertile and always wet, so these plots could grow several harvests a year. Mexico were literally building soil out of a lake. Now watch the city grow. The island settlement was named Tenochtitlan, and it spread outward ring by ring across the water. To bring in fresh drinking water, since the lake was salty, they ran an aqueduct from springs on a hill called Chapultepec, Grasshopper Hill. And to hold back the brackish water, a neighboring ruler named Nezahualcóyotl helped design an enormous. To connect the island to the mainland, they built long raised causeways, wide enough for crowds to cross, with wooden bridges that could be lifted to seal the city off. Dike, kilometers long, that split the lake in 2 and kept a sweeter pool around the city. A capital of stone temples and white plaster rising straight out of a lake, laced with canals instead of streets, fed by floating farms, reached by causeways over open water. By the year 1500, perhaps 200,000 people lived in Tenochtitlan. That made it one of the largest cities on the entire planet, bigger than London, bigger than Rome at the time. A city of canals so striking that the people who saw it next would call it the Venice of the New World. And those people arrived in 1519. Spanish soldiers under Hernán Cortés came over the mountains, looked down into the valley, and could not believe what they were seeing, a glittering island metropolis floating on a lake. 2 years later in 1521, after a brutal siege in which they cut the causeways and the aqueduct and fought street by street, the Spanish captured and largely destroyed Tenochtitlan. Then they made a fateful decision. Instead of moving somewhere dry and sensible, They rebuilt their own capital directly on top of the ruins, in the same spot, in the same lake. They tore down the great temple and raised a cathedral nearby. The island city of the Mexica became Mexico City of the Spanish Empire. The location won again, but the new rulers feared the water in a way the Mexica never had. They did not want canals and dikes and floating gardens. They wanted dry streets. And the lake, fed by the rains with no way to drain, kept flooding the growing city. In 1629, a single flood put the center of Mexico City underwater for around 5 years. So the Spanish, and then modern Mexico, declared war on the lake itself. This is the turning point, the decision that built the modern megacity and doomed its ground at the same time. For 4 centuries, engineers worked to drain the Valley of Mexico. An early engineer, named Enrico Martinez, began cutting a channel through the hills in the early 1600s to let the trapped water finally escape the closed basin. Later came a giant artificial canal, finished around 1900, and in the 20th century, an enormous system of deep drainage tunnels bored straight through the surrounding mountains. Bit by bit, they emptied the lakes that had defined this place for thousands of years. Where you are standing, the silver water drained away, and the lakebed turned to dusty, cracked clay. On that drained clay, the city exploded. In the 20th century, Mexico City grew from hundreds of thousands into millions, then into more than 20 million across its metropolitan sprawl, one of the biggest urban areas on Earth, filling the entire valley floor that was once open water. And this is where the land takes its revenge. The ground under Mexico City is not rock. It is the old lakebed, layers of soft, water-soaked clay, sometimes tens of meters deep. As the city grew, it needed water, and the easiest source was the aquifer right underneath it. So the city pumped, and still pumps, most of its drinking water out of the ground beneath its own feet. Researchers tracking it with satellite radar, including studies led by scientists such as Estelle Chaussard and Dario Solano Rojas, have shown that parts of the city have sunk many meters over the last century, and that because the clay collapses. As that water is sucked out, the clay compacts and the surface drops. Mexico City is sinking, not slowly, not gently. In the worst areas, the ground is dropping by something like 40 to 50 centimeters every single year. Permanently, this sinking is essentially irreversible. Refilling the aquifer would not lift the city back up. You can see it with your own eyes. The great cathedral built by the Spanish leans and dips where the floor has dropped unevenly. The Grand Angel of Independence monument has had extra steps added at its base over the decades because the ground around it kept falling away while the columns stood firm. Doorways tilt. Sidewalks ripple. The whole city is slowly settling back toward the lake the Mexico once farmed. And on top of all this thin, sinking ground sits a stadium. Because the valley floor is so high, more than 2,000 meters up, the air here is thin. And in that thin air, in a giant bowl of concrete called the Estadio Azteca, the world watched 2 of the most famous World Cup finals ever played, in 1970 and again in 1986. The same stadium is set to host World Cup matches again, making it the first ground in history to stage the tournament across 3 different World Cups. The whole planet, twice, has roared at a game played high on a mountain, on the drained bed of a salt lake. So think back to where you began. You were standing in the middle of a quiet lake, ringed by volcanoes, with nowhere for the water to drain, in what looked like the worst place on Earth to build anything. A wandering people took the one island nobody wanted, grew gardens out of the water, and turned it into one of the greatest cities of its age. Conquerors kept the spot, drained the lake, and stacked a megacity of 20 million on the soft clay it left behind. You are still standing in the middle of that lake. You just cannot see the water anymore, but the city can feel it. Every year, centimeter by centimeter, 20 million people sink a little closer to the lake that was here first.